All right. Number 8 here, we're going to talk about insecure deserialization. Now, this is a scary one that sounds a lot more complex than it is, really. It's pretty simple. But to give you an overview, first of all, what is serialization? It's taking apart data and converting it into a format that's better for storage and transport. What I mean is exporting some data to, say, a CSV, XML, or JSON file, JSON being the most popular today. Anytime you export data to one of those kind of file types, it's serializing data. So, for example, you have your original object represented here by some puzzle pieces. You can, in your code, you want to export that data to an XML. So you run using, a different method depending on the programming language you're using. You use a certain method to export it to an XML to the file system. And that file can be stored in either a database, it can be stored in memory, or it could be transferred over the network. Like I said, it's serialized for storage or transport purposes. The process of deserialization is when that data is taken out of the database or memory or received over the network, and then it's put back together into an object that's usable by your app, back into that original object that we started with. So it would be, for example, importing data from a CSV, XML, or JSON file in your app. So there's the XML file being received on the other end, whether it's extracted from the database or received over the network, and then being put back together into your original object. So now we've covered serialization and deserialization. Now for the fun part. So we have our malicious attacker from before, the raver, in a teddy bear costume. And say they want to change the object that gets deserialized on the web app or on the server. There are many methods to tamper with that serialized data while it's in storage or transport, and we're not going to talk about even any of those because there's just countless ways that this could be done. But the point is, it can be done easily by an attacker. So yeah, into the database, they might use SQL injection, or over the network, a meddler in the middle or a monster in the middle kind of attack where they manipulate data. So they change the data in one of those two places in memory or as it's traveling over the network, which taints the resulting XML file that's being imported into your app, which then gets imported into your app and put back together into the original object. Your app doesn't know. There's no way to tell. That's one of the reasons why this is a really bad vulnerability, and it's new as of 2017 to the OWASP top 10 list. So this is pretty new in the industry, and we're finding out it's more prevalent than we originally thought, 20 years ago. So luckily for us, this kind of vulnerability is pretty difficult to exploit. It took a long time for people to really discover it. So we have that going for us. It's relatively low risk, but there are certain things you have to remember, certain best practices if you want to do it safely. So if you have to serialize and deserialize data, which means just messing with XML, JSON files, CSV files in your app, then you need to make sure that you do it safely because it can be difficult to do. The impacts that it can have is for RCE, which stands for remote code execution. That's one of the worst kinds of results. It can also result in account hijacking or changes in access control, which is referred to as privilege escalation in cybersecurity. It can be used to DOS attack the server and crash it. For an example of what serializing and deserializing looks like, in JavaScript code, for example, let's just look at this code snippet. This is a snippet creating an object and storing that object in a JSON file. So here we have the opening script tag. We're creating an object called person, and this person has a name attribute of Bilbo and an age of 111 or 11D1, as hobbits would say it. So then you write that object to a JSON file. So you import the JSON library and then open this file.json for writing access. And then you do json.dump and you put the person object in there. And the rest of these arguments are just specific to the json.dump, but basically it's just being written to a file for later retrieval or for transport over the network to somewhere else. So after it's received on the other end or later on in your code, in your app, you want to read that file back and deserialize it. So you import the JSON library, you specify that same file path, and this time you use an R for read, not write. You set the person object to json.load f, and it takes the data in that JSON file and converts it back to a usable JavaScript object, basically. And then this last line just displays that object in the browser, which will just print out name Bilbo, age 111. So talking about prevention, the safest way to prevent this kind of vulnerability is just not to accept serialized data from untrusted sources. If you really, really have to do things with serialized and deserialization, you want to use a good library or module to do it for you and make sure that things are encoded and escaped correctly. This is like a lot of the other vulnerabilities, just making sure that the module is up to date and being maintained, and that somebody's actually reviewing the code and everything. You want to log deserialization exceptions and failures, because that could tell you when there's a malicious attacker trying to do something nefarious with this. And the logging exceptions and failures might just be something that's configured in your library or module that does this for you. So another reason to use a good current library or module. You also want to monitor incoming and outgoing network traffic. If you have control over that, or if somebody isn't already doing that, that's a good idea to do, just in case you see any huge spikes in traffic. That can indicate that there's something nefarious going on, or somebody is looking for a vulnerability in your app. For further reading, there's a cheat sheet on deserialization, and there's also a link to this website. It's a cybersecurity firm, a lot like OWASP, called Portswigger, that has really, really good article on insecure deserialization. So take a look at that if this didn't make sense to you, and that their example probably will.